The floorboard creaked beneath my boot, and I stopped breathing. Through the thin wall of that Montana hunting cabin, I could hear my nephew's voice, low and deliberate, the way he always spoke when he thought no one was listening. I had come back early from the lake because the cold front had moved in faster than the forecast promised. And my knees, both replaced 6 years ago, don't forgive wet weather the way they used to. I had not announced myself. I simply pushed open the side door, stomped the mud from my boots, and started down the hallway toward the main room where the wood stove was burning. That's when I heard him. "He's out on the water until 4, my nephew said. "That gives you the whole afternoon." A pause. Someone on the other end of a phone. Make it look like he slipped on the rocks. Old man, bad knees, rain coming in, nobody's going to ask questions. I stood there in that hallway with 63 years of a life I'd spent mostly being careful, and I felt something go cold inside me. Not the cold of the Montana air. Something else. Something that started deep in the chest and spread outward until my hands stopped trembling and simply went still. I had been a homicide detective for 22 years before I retired. I had stood in a lot of dark hallways. I had listened to a lot of terrible things, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. Because this voice was the voice of a boy I had helped raise after my brother died. The boy I had put through college. The boy who had called me Uncle Robert every Christmas morning for 31 years. I backed away from that hallway without a sound. I went back out the side door. I stood in the light rain on the porch and I breathed very slowly and I thought about exactly what I was going to do. Because here's the thing about spending 2 decades working homicide. You learn very quickly that panic is what gets people killed. Panic, and the assumption that you have more time than you do. I had no idea how long Marcus had been planning this, or who was on the other end of that phone, or what exactly the plan looked like in detail. What I did know was that I was alone in the Montana wilderness, 40 minutes from the nearest town, on a trip that my nephew had organized, planned, and insisted upon. A birthday gift, he'd called it. 63 and still sharp as a tack, he'd said, laughing. "You deserve a real trip, Uncle Robert. Just the 2 of us, like we used to go with Dad." I had been moved by that. I am not ashamed to say it. I had been genuinely moved. I walked back to the lake, and I sat on a flat rock near the water, and I did not let myself feel anything about Marcus. Not yet. Not until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. That's another thing the job teaches you. Emotion is information, but it is not a plan. Grief, betrayal, the sick, hollow feeling of realizing someone you loved was never quite who you believed. All of that would be waiting for me on the other side. Right now, I needed to think. I thought about my estate. After my wife, Carol, passed 4 years ago, I had updated my will. The house in Vermont, the investment accounts, the cabin property in Maine, all of it went to Marcus, because he was family, because I had no children of my own, and because I had believed, without question, that the boy Carol and I had helped raise deserved to benefit from what we had built together. The estate was worth a little over $2 million, not a fortune by certain standards. Enough to kill a man for, apparently. I sat by the water and I ran the logic. He needed it to look like an accident. The terrain out here made that plausible. The rocks along the north ridge were steep and slick, even in dry weather, and with the rain coming in, a 63-year-old man with replaced knees who lost his footing would not raise any eyebrows. No witnesses. Remote location. Marcus would be the grieving nephew who had found me. He would cry at the funeral. He probably had already rehearsed it. The person on the phone was the piece I didn't have. Someone local, probably. Someone who knew the land. My nephew had been to this area twice before. A year ago and 18 months. Before that I remembered him mentioning it, saying he'd scouted the property. I had thought he was being thoughtful, making sure the trip would be good for my knees. I understood now that he had been doing something else entirely. I needed evidence, and I needed to control where I was, and when. Here is what most people don't understand about dangerous situations. The person trying to harm you almost always believes they are smarter than you. That belief is their weakness. Marcus had watched me slow down over the past few years. He had seen me wince getting out of chairs, heard me complain about the altitude on our last trip together. He had drawn conclusions from those observations, and those conclusions made him careless. He had made a phone call inside a cabin with thin walls, while believing I was 400 meters away on a lake. That is not the behavior of someone who respects the person they're planning to kill. It's the behavior of someone who has already won the argument in their own head. I let him keep winning it, for a little while longer. I went back to the cabin at the time I normally would have, later in the afternoon. I came through the front door loudly, complaining about the weather, pulling off my waders with the kind of theatrical difficulty I had been performing less and less of in recent months. Marcus was by the stove, cooking something, and he turned around with a smile that I now read completely differently than I would have 12 hours ago. He asked if I'd caught anything. I said just the one, tossed it back. He laughed and said tomorrow would be better. I watched his eyes while I answered him. I had learned, early in my career, that the face lies, but the eyes manage it. His eyes were doing a kind of continuous small calculation, tracking my position, noting the time, filing information. I had seen that look before, on people sitting across an interview table, answering questions they had rehearsed for weeks. After dinner, I said I was tired and went to my room, and I did not sleep. I listened. Around 10 o'clock, I heard him step outside briefly. A short phone call. Words I couldn't make out through the log wall. He came back in, and the cabin went quiet. I had brought a satellite communicator with me, a habit from the old days, when Carol used to say I was paranoid and I used to say I was prepared. It was a small device, no bigger than a television remote, and it could send text messages to anyone in my contacts list from anywhere on Earth with a clear view of the sky. I had not mentioned it to Marcus. I had carried it in the inside pocket of my field jacket every day since we'd arrived, the same way I still carry a folding knife and a small flashlight, because some habits outlast the job that created them. I sent a message to a former colleague, a woman named Patricia who had worked major crimes with me for 11 years before she moved to the state police. I told her where I was, what I had heard, the name of my nephew, and the specific language he had used make it look like he slipped on the rocks. I told her the name of the property rental company and the GPS coordinates I had noted when we first arrived. I told her I was going to gather more evidence before moving, and I asked her to keep her phone on. She responded within 4 minutes. 2 words. Be careful. The next morning I told Marcus I wanted to hike the North Ridge. I watched something move across his face just briefly, half a second before he smiled and said that sounded like a great idea. Good views up there. He said he'd join me after he called his office. I said fine, go ahead. I'll start up and you can catch up. He said he'd be right behind me. I knew he wouldn't be. I went up the trail, but I went slowly, and I went with my eyes open. I had identified 2 things I needed. I needed to see who the other person was, and I needed to capture it on something I could hand to Patricia. I had my phone, which had a voice memo function, and I had the satellite communicator. I moved up the North Trail about a quarter mile to a spot I had scouted the day before, a wide, flat shelf of rock with good sight lines in 3 directions, and I waited. He came from below the tree line. Not Marcus, the other one. A man in his 40s, heavy build, in a green waxed canvas jacket with a local outfitter logo on the chest. He came up the trail with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going and believed exactly what they'd been told. That there was an old man up here with bad knees, alone, not paying attention. He had his hands in his pockets. His right hand was in his pocket. I stepped out from behind the outcrop where I had been standing and I said, "Nice morning for a walk." He stopped. The calculation in his eyes was immediate, and visible he was recalibrating, because this was not how the scene was supposed to open. Old men with bad knees did not step out from behind rocks and smile at strangers with the flat, patient expression of someone who has conducted a few hundred interviews. "You, the guide Marcus hired?" I asked. His mouth opened. Nothing came out for a moment. "Because if you are," I said, "you should know that I've been recording this conversation since you came up the trail, and I sent your description and current GPS location to a state police contact about 90 seconds ago." I showed him the satellite communicator in my left hand. The screen lit up with an active message thread. I watched the thing go out of him. It wasn't dramatic. It almost never is. In reality, People in those moments don't collapse or confess in speeches. They just lose something, some internal pressure that was holding them upright, and they go quiet and still, and suddenly look very tired. I didn't agree to, he said. It was just a scare, the man said. Finally, a scare, I repeated. He said you two had a dispute and he just wanted to... He stopped. He pulled his hand out of his pocket. It was empty. We stood there on that ridge in the thin Montana morning, and I listened to him talk for about 15 minutes. He was a local handyman who did work for the rental company. A man named Gene who had done odd jobs for Marcus on the 2 previous trips up here. A man who had gotten drawn into something piece by piece, until the pieces had made a picture he hadn't quite looked at clearly until this moment. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He had thought, he said, that this was mostly about frightening me, making me lose my footing. Nothing serious. I did not tell him what I believed Marcus had actually intended. I let him talk. I let the voice memo run. I called Patricia from the ridge and put Jean on with her directly. I came back down the trail about an hour later, alone. Marcus was by the truck when I came out of the tree line. He saw my face, and he knew. People always know. When it's over, some understanding runs ahead of the specific facts, and you can see the moment it arrives. Uncle Robert, he said. Don't, I said. Not angry, just tired. I sat down on a log at the edge of the clearing, and I looked at him for a long time. 31 years of Christmas mornings. The boy sitting beside me in a hospital corridor the night his father, my brother, died of a heart attack at 54. The college graduation where he'd said, into the microphone, in front of 400 people, that he wouldn't be standing there without me. I had kept a photograph of that moment on the wall of my study. I thought about that photograph. How long? I asked. He didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, 8 months. 8 months. He had been planning this for 8 months. Was it only about the estate? He looked away. You were going to change it. You told me last year you were thinking about leaving part of it to charity, to the foundation Carol supported. I was thinking about it, I said. I hadn't decided. I couldn't risk it, he said. I've been waiting. He stopped himself. Waiting, I said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I want to tell you that in that moment I felt nothing but cold clarity. But that would be a lie. What I felt was a grief so dense it was almost physical, like something heavy settling into the spaces between my ribs. This was the child I had helped make into a man. This was the person who had stood in my kitchen on the day we buried Carol and held my hand and told me I wasn't alone. And every one of those moments, I understood now, had been happening alongside something else, something parallel and hidden, a version of Marcus that had always been doing his own separate accounting, always tracking what he stood to gain and what he stood to lose. I don't know if that version was always there, or if it grew. I suspect I will never know for certain. The sheriff's department from the county arrived 40 minutes later. Patricia had moved fast, the way she always moved, and she had called ahead. 2 deputies and an investigator. Jean had already given a recorded statement by phone. Marcus did not say anything else after that first conversation. He asked for a lawyer calmly and quietly, and they put him in the back of a vehicle, and I watched it go down the dirt road and disappear around the bend through the pine trees. I stood there in the clearing for a while after everyone else had moved. The rain had stopped, and the light was coming through low and gray from the west, the way it does up here in the late afternoon, turning everything silver and still. I thought about the drive back. I thought about the photograph on my study wall. I thought about Carol, who had loved Marcus the same way I had, completely and without calculation, the way we loved everyone we chose to love. I drove myself back to the nearest town and checked into a motel, and I called my attorney from a chair by the window while the last of the daylight faded out over the mountains. I told him to begin the process of revising the estate immediately. The house in Vermont, the accounts, the cabin in Maine. I told him I wanted the bulk of it directed to the scholarship fund Carol had spent the last 10 years building, the one that put first-generation college students through nursing school in rural communities. She would have wanted that. I think, somewhere in the part of me that is still her husband after all this time, I had always known she would have wanted that. Marcus was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation, and several related counts. Gene cooperated fully with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges, and his testimony was detailed and consistent. The trial, when it came, was not long. Marcus did not look at me during most of it. At sentencing, he was given 23 years. I did not feel satisfied by that number. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a story like this one to end with some clean sense of justice. The ledger balanced, the wound closed. That is not how it works. What I felt was the permanent absence of something, the specific shape of a relationship that had seemed solid and turned out to have been hollow all along, and that shape does not fill back in just because the courtroom proceedings are finished. It stays empty. You learn to move around it. What I will tell you is this. A few months after the trial, I drove up to Vermont, and I spent 2 weeks in the house alone. I went through every room. I looked at every photograph. I sat in Carol's reading chair in the afternoons, and I thought about what the two of us had built and who had benefited from it and what it had meant. And I understood, in a way I hadn't quite before, that the things you pour yourself into, the people you believe in, the time you give, the love you extend without keeping score, those things do not become worthless when someone turns out to be unworthy of them. The love was real. My brother was real. The boy Marcus used to be, before whatever calculation took over, was real. I cannot get any of that back, and I do not think it was wasted. I had the photograph taken down from my study wall. I did not throw it away. I put it in a drawer, because I am not yet certain what the right thing to do with it is. And I have learned, over 63 years, that you do not have to resolve every question immediately. Some things you carry until you understand them, and you give yourself the time to do that without apology. What I know is that I came home from Montana. I walked back into my life with my knees still bad and my eyes still open and something irreplaceable missing, and I kept going. Not because it was easy, and not because the grief was small, because that is what you do when you are the kind of person who chooses to survive. You gather your evidence, you make your calls, you walk back down the mountain, and you keep going. That's the only kind of revenge I know how to take, the kind where you're still here, the kind where you take everything they tried to take from you and you use it anyway on your terms for the things that actually matter. I'm still standing, and that, in the end, is enough.